I still remember the first time I heard about the woman who vanished in the Montana backcountry. It was late summer, 6 years ago, and I was sitting in a roadside diner off Highway 200, sipping burnt coffee and watching the sun cast long golden beams across the endless sprawl of pine and granite. Her face was on the local news, on the posters taped to gas station windows, on the bulletin boards at trailheads, a smiling woman in her early 30s, auburn hair, eyes the color of moss after rain. The story caught me because she wasn't some reckless tourist or unprepared day hiker. No, she was experienced, they said. She had hiked most of Glacier, knew the Swan Range like the back of her hand, and carried the kind of gear that should have kept her safe for weeks. But all that knowledge, all that preparation, it didn't stop her from disappearing without so much as a trace. The search had been massive, bigger than most I'd seen in Montana. Helicopters circled the canyons, volunteers combed ridgelines, dogs traced the scent of her last known camp. They found her pack leaning against a tree, stove still packed, food half-eaten, tent pitched but empty. But they never found her. Not a footprint, not a shred of clothing, not even a torn scrap of fabric snagged on brush. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole, and after the weeks dragged into months, people whispered that maybe it had. Folks around here have always been quick to spin stories about disappearances. Something ancient in the woods, some old hunger that pulls people off the trail and keeps them. I never put stock in that, but I admit that the silence around her case was heavy. Too heavy. The years rolled on, and most forgot. That's what happens with missing people. At first their names echo in every bar, every post office, every sheriff's report. Then, slowly, they fade, like smoke drifting off into the mountains. New faces replace old. New tragedies claim the headlines. I might have forgotten her myself, if not for what happened 6 years later. That's when they found something in the chimney of a remote hunting cabin, miles from any marked trail, a place so isolated that even lifelong residents of the valley had to squint at a map to remember where it was. And what they found there changed the way I look at these mountains forever. But before I tell you about the chimney, I have to tell you how I came to know that cabin. See, I've lived my whole life in western Montana, in towns that cling to the edge of wilderness. My father was a logger, my mother a teacher, and I grew up with sap in my hair and pine needles in my boots. When other kids spent their summers chasing baseballs or sitting in movie theaters, I was hiking ridges, fishing streams, or setting snares for rabbits. The land raised me as much as my parents did, and by the time I was grown, I worked as a guide, taking tourists into the high country, teaching them how to pitch tents, ford rivers, read bear scat. I knew every drainage, every saddle, every deer trail worn into the earth by generations of hooves. But the older I got, the more I noticed how easy it was for people, good people, smart people, to vanish out there. The mountains don't forgive mistakes. A turned ankle, a storm blowing in faster than you expect, the simple act of wandering just a few steps off trail while chasing a view, any of it can shift into disaster. Still, I never thought much of it beyond the usual risks, until the day I followed a wounded elk into a drainage I'd never bothered to explore before. That's where I first saw the cabin. It sat hunched beneath the black timber like an old animal too stubborn to die, its roof sagging under decades of snow, windows shuttered with warped planks. No trail led to it, no sign of smoke or life. Just a structure swallowed by the wilderness, half forgotten and wholly alone. I don't know why, but something about that cabin gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way the trees leaned away from it, as if the forest itself didn't want to be too close. Maybe it was the way the door hung half open, yet no sound came from inside. I didn't step in that day. I had meat to pack out, and the sun was sinking fast. But I marked it on my mental map, told myself I'd come back. And when the news finally broke, years later, that bones, human bones, had been found in that chimney, I knew at once it was her. The woman who vanished. The woman whose story had haunted the ridges like a ghost no one wanted to name. You see, people like to think of disappearances as sudden things, as if someone steps into the trees and is instantly gone, like a switch flipping. But that's not how it happens. A disappearance is a process, a slow unraveling. It begins with a step off the trail, then a missed landmark, then a choice to keep pushing deeper instead of turning back. Fear creeps in, then exhaustion, then the strange quiet of realizing you are no longer where you thought you were. I've seen it happen to people I've guided. The forest strips you down, layer by layer, until you are nothing but breath and bone, an animal among animals. That woman must have walked herself right into that fate, though how she ended up in that cabin's chimney, I can only guess. I tell this story not because I want to scare anyone, but because I want to remember. In the silence of these mountains, memories die easy. People vanish, and soon their names vanish too, leaving nothing but rumors. But when I stood before that cabin, years before they cracked the mortar of its chimney and pulled her from the ash and soot, I felt something old watching me. Something that did not want me there. And if you believe nothing else I say, believe this. When the forest takes someone, it doesn't always give them back the way you expect. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides them in places you wouldn't dare to look. When word finally spread about the discovery inside that chimney, I wasn't surprised the way most folks were. Shocked, yes, but not surprised. For years, I had kept that cabin lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I knew it wasn't the kind of place someone stumbled into by accident. It sat tucked into a drainage with no proper trail in or out, surrounded by deadfall and swampy ground. If you didn't know it was there, you'd never find it. Hell, even if you did know, you might pass it a dozen times and still miss it, because the forest seemed eager to cover its tracks, as if ashamed of the thing it sheltered. And yet, she had ended up there. That missing woman, 6 years gone, her last traces hidden in the soot-stained throat of an abandoned chimney. I can still remember how the news broke. It wasn't some polished press conference or official release. It came through whispers first, the way everything does in rural Montana. A rancher in town said the sheriff's office had cordoned off a site up near the upper Swan drainage. A local outfitter muttered over beers that they finally found her. And then one morning, I stopped by the post office and saw the Gazette front page. Remains recovered in remote cabin, possible link to 2016 disappearance. The article was thin, just a skeleton of facts. Hunters had reported a foul smell coming from the chimney when they opened the place for the season. Sheriff's deputies investigated, called in state authorities, and eventually confirmed that bones had been lodged deep inside, along with scraps of clothing and a few personal effects. They were waiting on dental records and DNA for confirmation, but everyone already knew. For most people, the discovery tied a knot on the story. The mystery solved, the file closed, the woman accounted for. But for me, it only unraveled the knot further. How in God's name had she gotten into that chimney? The thing was narrow, not wide enough for a grown adult to slip down easily. The cabin itself had been abandoned for decades. No one had been there to help or harm her, not officially anyway. Some speculated she had gotten lost, stumbled upon the cabin seeking shelter, and somehow climbed into the chimney herself. Maybe delirious, maybe hypothermic. But I've seen hypothermia victims, and I know the way confusion sets in, the way they undress, the way they curl up in the strangest places. Yet something about her ending up wedged in that chimney felt deliberate, as though someone or something had guided her there. The sheriff dismissed that talk quickly. They always do. Too many resources had already been sunk into her case, too many years wasted chasing ghosts. The official line was simple: tragic accident. End of story. But in the bars and kitchens of the valley, people whispered different tales. Some said she had been running from someone, maybe even hiding in that chimney to escape a pursuer. Others swore she had been lured there by lights or voices, the kind of strange stories that always bubble up when the wilderness is involved. A few even muttered about the old legends, the ones that say there are places in these mountains where the land itself opens to swallow a person whole, where they disappear into cracks of reality, not meant for us. I never put much stock in those tales, but after that discovery, I found myself lying awake at night, replaying the image of that sagging cabin, its chimney a black mouth, and wondering what secrets it had swallowed. You see, I knew that cabin better than most. After first stumbling on it years ago, I made a point of returning. Not often, once every couple of years maybe, but enough to keep it familiar. I never lingered long inside. The place gave me chills I couldn't quite shake, a heaviness in the chest as if the air itself carried weight. But curiosity always dragged me back. I'd find excuses, tracking game, scouting new routes, or justifying that I was checking for trespassers on behalf of nobody in particular. The truth was I wanted to understand it. Who built it? When? Why so far off the beaten path? Some cabins make sense. Trappers' huts, old logger bunkhouses, hunting camps. This one didn't. Its foundation was stone, its timbers thick, and the craftsmanship too fine for a temporary shelter. Yet no record of it existed in the county archives. It was as though it had been willed into existence and then promptly forgotten. One visit in particular stays with me. It was early spring, snow still clinging in patches, the forest wet and raw. I pushed open the cabin door and found the interior littered with small bones, birds, rodents, maybe a fox. They were scattered near the hearth, brittle and yellowed, as if something had been dragging them in and leaving them there. The fireplace smelled faintly of char despite no one having used it in years, and when I leaned in close, I thought I saw scratch marks running along the inner bricks of the chimney. At the time, I brushed it off. Animals, I told myself. Soot can stain bricks in strange ways, and critters nest in chimneys all the time. But when they pulled that woman's bones from the same shaft, those old scratches returned to my mind with awful clarity. The strangest part is what they found with her. The paper never went into detail, but I heard things, snippets carried by deputies' wives and passed like contraband at coffee shops. They said she still had her hiking boots, though one was wedged higher in the flue, as if it had come off while she struggled. They said there were strands of hair tangled in the mortar, long auburn strands that matched her missing poster perfectly. They said, too, that there were objects in the ash that didn't belong. Coins too old for her to have carried, a rusted knife with no fingerprints, and what looked like a child's wooden toy, charred but intact. None of that made the official. I didn't know her personally. I'd never guided her, never crossed paths on a trail. But in a strange way, her story had become part of mine. When you live your whole life in a place like this, the land teaches you things. It teaches you respect, humility, and sometimes fear. And every disappearance, every unsolved mystery, feels like a lesson carved into the mountains themselves. She was one of those lessons. The lesson that no amount of preparation shields you from the unknown, that sometimes the wilderness holds secrets you can't chart on a map. And when they pulled her from that chimney, 6 years too late, I realized the lesson wasn't finished. It was only beginning. I drove out to the drainage not long after the news broke. I couldn't help myself. The roads were rough, the kind that chew up tires and rattle your bones, and eventually I had to park and hike the rest of the way. I didn't expect to get close. Figured the sheriff would still have the place taped off, but when I arrived, the cabin sat silent and untouched. No cruiser, no deputies. Just the same sagging roof, the same dark chimney rising like a finger against the sky. I stood there for a long time, staring, listening to report, of course. Why would it? Easier to stamp accident and move on. But those details the wind sifted through the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if it had swallowed the sound of birds and insects. And in that silence, I swear I heard something else, a faint dragging sound from inside the chimney, as though stones still remembered the struggle lodged in its throat. I didn't go inside that day. My gut told me to turn back, and I've learned to trust my gut out here. But the image followed me home, followed me into my sleep. The missing woman, the chimney, the strange objects found beside her bones, all of it twined into a knot of unease I couldn't shake. And though the sheriff and the papers might have closed the book, I knew better. That story wasn't over. Not for her. Not for me. Not for these mountains. After that spring, the woman's case became something of an obsession for me. I didn't talk about it much, not even to my closest friends, because folks around here don't take kindly to dwelling on dark things. You bring up a missing person too often, and people will either call you paranoid or superstitious. Or worse, they'll think you're chasing some kind of fame. I wanted neither. What I wanted was clarity. Not closure, no, because closure is just a word lawmen use to keep people from asking questions, but clarity. I wanted to understand how a woman with so much backcountry sense ended up in a chimney, of all places. And more than that, I wanted to understand why that cabin had been built there in the first place, tucked away in a part of Montana where no one had business being. I began by asking around quietly. Old-timers in Sealy Lake, loggers who'd worked the Swan Valley back in the 70s, guides older than me who had since retired. Most shrugged when I described the cabin, but a few got that look in their eyes, the one where memory brushes against something they'd rather forget. One man, a retired Forest Service worker named Howard, told me he'd stumbled across it once in the late 80s while running a survey line. He never went inside, he said, because the place felt wrong. Too quiet, he muttered, and then he tapped his cigarette ash into his coffee and refused to say more. Another, an old outfitter named Clay, claimed he'd heard about the place from his grandfather, who said trappers used it back before the turn of the century. But when I pressed for details, Clay shook his head and said, "Best leave it where it lies, son. Some places don't want their story told." That kind of talk only fed my curiosity. I started digging through records at the county courthouse, sifting through land deeds, tax maps, and survey logs. Nothing. The drainage was marked as federal forest land, never homesteaded, never leased. No mention of a structure. I even drove down to Missoula and spent a day in the university archives, poring over old logging company maps. Still nothing. The cabin might as well have been invisible on paper, as if it had simply sprouted from the ground like a tumor in the wilderness. And that, more than anything, convinced me I had to go back. Not just for an hour or two, not just to glance in the door and leave. No, I had to study it. I had to know. So late that summer, when the snow had melted off the high ridges and the days stretched long, I packed a light kit and headed into the drainage. It was a 3-day hike through thick timber and swampy basins, the kind of country that chews up anyone who isn't prepared. I carried a small tent, though I doubted I'd use it, a .45 on my hip for bears, and enough food to keep me comfortable. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to lean over me, heavy and close, the light dripping through the canopy in thin green shafts. I saw few signs of game, which was odd for that time of year. No fresh elk tracks, no deer scat, no squirrels chattering. Just silence and stillness, broken only by the occasional groan of wind through deadfall. It felt less like I was hiking through wilderness and more like I was trespassing through someone's abandoned cathedral. On the third day, I reached the cabin. It looked just as I remembered, hunched, sagging, half consumed by moss and lichen. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately, damp wood, ash, and something sour, something like rusted iron. The hearth yawned black against the far wall, its stones slick with years of soot. I walked inside slowly, running my fingers along the warped timbers. The place was built solid, more solid than any temporary shelter had a right to be, the logs notched with skill, the joints tight despite decades of neglect. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. And yet, the cabin radiated neglect, as if its very purpose had been abandonment. I spent hours there, sketching the layout, photographing the beams, measuring the chimney. It was wider than I'd remembered, but still not wide enough for a woman to simply fall into. No, she would have had to climb in or be forced. I crouched before the hearth and peered upward, shining my headlamp into the dark flue. The light bounced off something jagged. At first I thought it was stone, but when I shifted my angle, I saw deep grooves running vertically, as though fingernails or claws had scraped along the brick. The scratches were old, filled with soot, but they spiraled higher than I could see. My skin prickled. I snapped a few photos, though I wasn't sure why. It felt wrong, like documenting a grave. That night, I camped 100 yards from the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside. The air around the place was heavy, and though I'm not a man prone to nerves, I felt watched. Around midnight, as the fire burned low, I heard something faint, like stones shifting, or something dragging across brick. I froze, every hair on my neck standing straight. It came again, louder this time, from the direction of the cabin. I gripped my pistol and waited, heart hammering, but the sound faded as suddenly as it had begun. The forest fell silent again, and eventually I dozed in fits, though every dream carried the weight of that chimney. The next morning, I forced myself back inside. I wanted to check the floorboards, see if maybe the place had a cellar. I pried at the planks with my knife, but found nothing but damp earth. Still, the unease grew. It was in the way the light slanted through the windows, casting shapes that looked like figures moving when I glanced too quick. It was in the smell, that sour tang of iron and ash. Most of all, it was in the hearth itself. No matter where I stood, I felt pulled toward it, as if the chimney were a throat waiting to swallow me. I thought of her then, the missing woman, 6 years lost, her bones pressed into that flue, and for the first time I wondered if she had truly gone there alone. When I finally left, I felt no relief. The forest didn't lighten, and the silence didn't lift. If anything, the weight followed me, pressing on my shoulders all the way back to the trailhead. I told myself I wouldn't return, that some mysteries were best left to rot in the timber. But the truth was I knew I'd be back. The cabin had its hooks in me, the same way it had in her. And though I didn't yet understand it, I was beginning to suspect that her disappearance, and her grisly end in that chimney, was only one thread in a much larger pattern. The weeks after that trip bled into each other like water over stone, but the memory of the cabin clung to me with a grip I couldn't shake. I'd be stacking firewood or patching fence, and suddenly I'd smell that same sour, metallic tang that hung in its timbers. I'd be half asleep and hear the faint rasp of something dragging against stone. Worse, I'd see her, her face from the old missing posters, smiling in sunlight, superimposed against the chimney's black mouth. It wasn't guilt exactly. I hadn't known her, hadn't been there when she vanished. But there's a peculiar kind of responsibility that comes with being close to a mystery no one else dares to touch. It's like the land had chosen me to witness, to carry the burden she'd left behind. And whether I wanted it or not, I couldn't let it go. So I started retracing her steps. The search logs were public record if you knew how to ask, and I knew a deputy who owed me a favor. Her last known location was a small lake tucked high in the Swan Range, a half-day's hike from the nearest road. Her tent had been found pitched near the shore, her pack leaning against a tree, everything in place except her. Some of the volunteers who searched back then remembered the scene well. One told me it was eerie how untouched the campsite looked, as if she'd stepped out for a drink of water and never returned. Another swore there had been odd tracks nearby, not boots, not bear, not elk, but when the official report came out, none of that was mentioned. It had all been scrubbed down to the bland language of insufficient evidence. I hiked to that lake myself one cool September morning. The air was crisp, and the larch were just beginning to turn gold. I found the clearing easily enough, though 6 years of weather had erased most signs of her camp. Still, I felt the absence lingering, like a shadow burned into the earth. I walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the water. That's when I noticed something strange. About 100 yards uphill from the site, half hidden under a tangle of brush, was a faint trail. Not a real one, just a subtle depression in the earth, as though something heavy had been dragged or something large had moved repeatedly in the same direction. It led deeper into the timber, toward the drainage where the cabin lay waiting. I followed it. At first the trail was faint, broken by roots and fallen limbs, but as I pressed on it became clearer, as though guiding me. My chest tightened with every step, because I knew I was walking the same path she must have taken. I imagined her here, confused, maybe frightened, stumbling through the brush as daylight faded. But then the image shifted. What if she hadn't been lost? What if she'd been following something? Maybe a sound, maybe a voice, maybe something even stranger. I'd heard of cases where people swore they'd been led off trail, compelled by forces they couldn't explain. It always sounded like superstition to me. Until now. The trail carried me all the way to the edge of the swampy basin where I'd first spotted the cabin years ago. My gut turned cold. It was too direct to be coincidence, too clean to be random wandering. She had been pulled toward that place, just like me. Whether by chance, instinct, or something older, I couldn't say. But the realization hit me hard. Whatever had claimed her, it hadn't happened at her campsite. It had happened because she followed this path into the timber, the same path that drew me like a moth to flame. That night, I sat by my fire and turned it over in my head. If she'd gone willingly, chasing some lure, why climb into the chimney? And if she'd gone unwillingly, dragged or forced, who, or what, had the strength and reason to do it? My mind spiraled through possibilities. A hermit living unseen in the woods? A fugitive hiding in that cabin? Some predator more cunning than bear or wolf? None of it fit, and the more I tried to piece it together, the more the forest around me seemed to press close, listening to my thoughts. It was as if the mountains themselves knew the answers, but refused to let me in. Over the next few months, I made more trips. Always alone, always under the guise of scouting. Each time, I felt myself drawn closer to the cabin, though I rarely stayed long. I noticed patterns, the way the trees leaned away, the way animals avoided the place entirely, the way even the wind seemed to hush when you neared the clearing. Once, I found a set of deer tracks circling the cabin but never crossing within 10 yards, as though an invisible wall had turned the animal aside. Another time, I found stones stacked near the door in a crude cairn, though I hadn't left them and no one else should have been there. The worst was the night I finally gave in and slept inside. I had told myself it was for research, to see if the structure offered any warmth, to test the air currents in the chimney. But the truth was, I wanted to prove to myself that my fear was nothing but imagination. I unrolled my bag on the warped floor and forced myself to drift off. Sometime after midnight, I woke with my chest tight, unable to breathe. My eyes snapped open, and in the dim glow of embers I saw movement in the hearth, something pale pressing against the inside of the chimney, like hands pushing outward through stone. I blinked hard, convinced it was a dream or a trick of firelight, but the marks stayed. They clawed and scraped, soundless, desperate. My body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Finally, with what little will I had left, I lit my lantern. The light flared, and the vision vanished. The hearth was empty, but the scratch marks seemed deeper than before.
I didn't sleep again that night.
I packed at dawn and left without looking back, but the image followed me like a brand on my brain. If those were just dreams, then why had the scratches seemed new? If it was imagination, then why did I find ash smeared on my hands though I'd never touched the chimney? Each trip left me with more questions and answers, and each question dug the hook deeper. The woman's fate was no longer just a tragedy. It was a warning, one I was beginning to fear was aimed not only at her, but at me. By winter, my thoughts were consumed by the cabin and the woman's bones they'd pulled from its chimney. I tried to shake it, I really did, told myself to focus on work, on the small rhythms of daily life. Chopping wood, plowing snow, helping neighbors haul hay. But no matter what I did, the image of that chimney rose in my mind like smoke I couldn't breathe away. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake listening to the wind claw at the eaves of my house, and I'd swear it carried the faint echo of scraping nails on stone. Some nights, half asleep, I'd hear her voice too. Though I'd never known her well enough to recognize it, I convinced myself it was hers. Low, pleading, calling from somewhere deep in the walls. I told myself not to go back until spring. But the first thaw came early that year, and with it, a restlessness I couldn't resist. In March, I packed my kit again and snowshoed into the drainage, breaking trail through knee-deep slush. The forest was bleak, silent except for the creak of ice shifting on swollen creeks. When I reached the cabin, the roof sagged under snow load, icicles like teeth hanging from the eaves. I stood there for a long while, debating whether to enter. But by then I knew there was no choice. Whatever held me to this place wasn't going to let me walk away. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the hearth gaping like a wound. My breath fogged in the stillness, and for the first time, I noticed symbols scratched faintly into the stone around the fireplace. Circles, crosses, spirals, carved deep and worn smooth by soot. I ran my glove across one and felt the grooves bite back, as though the stone itself remembered pain.
Who had carved them?
And why here in a cabin no one admitted to building? The marks didn't look like anything I'd seen in books. They looked older, primitive, like something made in desperation. That night, I lit a small fire in the hearth, against my better judgment. The flames leapt, and the smoke curled thick, reluctant to rise up the chimney. I coughed, eyes stinging, and for a moment I thought I saw shapes forming in the smoke, faces, maybe, or hands stretching upward. My skin prickled, and I nearly doused the fire then and there, but some stubborn part of me refused. If she had died here, if her bones had been trapped in that flue, then maybe the smoke carried some trace of her story. Maybe fire could loosen what stone had kept bound. Around midnight, as the fire guttered low, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the crusted snow. My blood ran cold. I snatched my pistol and aimed at the door, heart pounding. The steps stopped just outside. I held my breath, finger trembling on the trigger. Then, faint as a whisper, came a knock. 3 times.
Knock, knock, knock. My throat went dry.
I forced myself to move, to fling the door open. Yet no one was there. Only darkness, snow falling softly, the forest silent as a tomb. I closed the door fast and sat back against the wall, pistol clutched tight. But the knocking didn't leave me. I heard it in the wood, in the stone, in my chest. The next morning, I searched the snow around the cabin. No tracks. No sign of visitor, animal, or man. Yet I knew what I'd heard. I packed quickly and left, but each step away felt like dragging chains. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was sick with exhaustion, my mind buzzing with questions I couldn't answer. And though I swore I'd never return, deep down I knew it was a lie. Weeks passed. I pored over old maps again, hunting for any trace of the cabin's origin. This time, I widened my search. In a dusty archive at the Montana Historical Society, I found mention of an expedition from 1893, trappers who vanished while wintering somewhere in the Swan. Only fragments of their journals survived, but one line stuck with me. We built shelter where the stones whisper. Fire keeps them at bay, though chimney swallows all. The words clawed into me. Could that be the same cabin? And if so, had they too known the pull of that chimney, the strange hunger of its stones? I began connecting dots that maybe shouldn't have been connected. Other disappearances in the valley, dating back decades. Hunters who never returned. Hikers whose camps were found intact but empty. The patterns weren't clear, not on paper. But in my gut, I felt them align. It was as though the land had veins of shadow running through it, and that cabin sat squarely on one. A wound that bled people into its hearth. One night, unable to sleep, I drove out to the lake where her camp had been found. The snow was melting, and the ice groaned on the water. I stood in the clearing where her tent had once stood and tried to picture her last moments here, packing her bag, lacing her boots, deciding to step away. Did she feel the pull the way I had? Did she know she was walking toward her own end? Or had she believed, right up until the moment she touched the chimney, that she was being led to safety? The wind carried down the slope, cold and sharp, and for just a second I thought I heard a voice writing it. My name, whispered soft as breath. I turned, flashlight cutting through the trees, but saw nothing. Still, my chest tightened, because if the land had begun speaking my name, then I was already too deep. I was already part of the story. And part of me feared I'd end the same way she did, swallowed by stone, remembered only in whispers, my bones hidden in a chimney that no one should ever have built. By the time summer rolled around again, I knew I couldn't keep circling the mystery without facing it head-on. Every trip, every sleepless night, every whisper I thought I heard, it was leading me back to that cabin, whether I wanted it or not. I stopped pretending to myself that I was just researching or scouting. The truth was simpler and far heavier. I needed to understand what had happened to her and what tied her fate to that chimney. More than that, I needed to know why the cabin itself seemed alive in ways no building should be. So I planned one last trip, a longer stay, where I wouldn't just study the place from the outside but live inside it until the land revealed what it wanted to. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Maybe that was foolish, but I knew if I spoke it aloud, someone would try to stop me. People in the valley had already begun to mutter that I was spooked or obsessed, and in truth, they weren't wrong. I packed light but thorough, extra batteries, a tape recorder, notebooks, ropes, enough food for a week. I also packed her photo, torn from an old missing poster. I didn't know why, only that it felt right to bring her along. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was the thread pulling me deeper. The hike was harder that summer. The heat pressed heavy, and thunderstorms rolled across the peaks. Each crack of thunder seemed to chase me further into the drainage, until at last I broke through the trees and saw the cabin squatting in its clearing like something waiting. I felt no relief, only dread. Yet I stepped inside, unrolled my bag, and told myself I wouldn't leave until I had answers. The first day passed uneventfully. I sketched more symbols in my notebook, noted how the light fell differently through the windows at different hours, and studied the chimney. The grooves were unmistakable now, deep claw marks spiraling upward. I recorded myself describing them, but when I played the tape back, there were faint sounds under my voice. Scratching, faint at first, then louder, like nails dragging across stone. I rewound 3 times, certain it was just noise from the recorder, but the sound was too clear, too deliberate. My stomach knotted, but I forced myself to keep going. That night, I lit a fire again. Smoke rose sluggishly, clinging to the walls before creeping upward. I sat across from the hearth, her photo in my lap, and whispered aloud the questions I hadn't dared speak before. Why here? Why you? Why the chimney? The fire popped, and in that instant, I swear I heard a voice, not in my ears, but in my head, carried by the crackle of flame. One word, soft and broken, trapped. I nearly dropped the photo into the fire. My pulse raced, but some part of me steadied because if the land was speaking, then maybe it wanted to be heard. The days blurred after that. I stopped marking hours, stopped counting meals. My notebooks filled with sketches of the symbols, with transcriptions of the whispers I thought I heard in the smoke. Sometimes, the voice was hers, I was sure of it, pleading, begging. Other times, it was deeper, harsher, like stone grinding against stone. I couldn't make out words, only the intent. Hunger. The cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a mouth. And the chimney wasn't just a flue, it was a throat. That realization came to me one night like a weight pressing down. The cabin had been built not to protect those inside, but to contain something. A cage disguised as a home. But cages fail. Mortar cracks, timbers rot, and what is trapped grows restless. I think that's why she ended up in the chimney. Maybe she'd heard the same whispers I had. Maybe she thought she was helping someone. Maybe she thought it was the only way to quiet the hunger that leaked through those stones. Whatever the reason, she became part of the cage, her bones sealing it for 6 long years until hunters stumbled across her prison. And with her pulled out, with her body disturbed, I feared the thing inside had grown restless again. On my 5th night, I woke to the sound of weeping. Faint, muffled, coming from the hearth. My lantern flickered, and I sat frozen listening. The weeping turned to a low, rhythmic thud, as if a fist was pounding from inside the chimney. My mind screamed to leave, but my body betrayed me. I crawled closer, drawn like iron to a magnet. I pressed my ear against the stone, and what I heard hollowed me out. A voice, layered and echoing, whispering my name. Not hers. Mine. I stumbled back, terror clawing at my ribs. My pistol lay useless in my hand. You can't shoot stone. Can't kill whispers. I nearly bolted then and there, but some stubborn core held me in place. If the thing knew my name, then I was already entangled. Running wouldn't sever it. Only understanding would. So I stayed. I stayed until the whispers faded and the silence returned, though I knew it wasn't silence at all. It was waiting. By dawn, I was hollow-eyed and shaking, but I forced myself to pack. I knew I couldn't last longer. Another night might break me. As I shouldered my gear, I tucked her photo into the hearthstones, as if offering it back to whatever lived there. She's not forgotten, I said aloud, my voice rough. But I won't join her. Not yet. For a moment, The air seemed to ease, the weight lifting just enough for me to breathe. Then I stepped outside, sunlight striking my face, and began the long walk back through the timber. Even now, I don't know what I brought home with me. The cabin stays in my dreams, the chimney rising taller each night, swallowing light. Sometimes I hear her voice, sometimes the deeper one. And sometimes I wonder if the land has simply marked me for the same fate. Maybe one day I'll vanish too, and someone else will stumble on my story in the soot of that cursed chimney. All I know is this: the mountains don't just take. They hold. They keep. And once they've chosen you, they never let go. It has been months since I left that place for the last time, yet the cabin has never truly let me go. Every day I wake with the feeling that ash still clings to my tongue, that smoke still lingers in my lungs. People see me in town and say I look thinner, older, like something's eating at me from the inside. Maybe they're right. I tell them I've just been working too hard, that the woods are demanding this year, but the truth is simpler. I brought the woods back with me. Or maybe the woods brought me back with them. Whichever way it is, the line between me and that chimney is thinner than I want to admit. I tried to ground myself in the old rhythms. I split firewood, fixed the sagging fence, even drove into Missoula once to sit at a diner counter and eat pancakes among strangers. But nothing feels normal anymore. Every sound reminds me of that place. The crack of a log in the stove makes me think of bones shifting. The hiss of steam off the griddle reminds me of whispers curling through smoke. Some nights, I wake to the smell of burning pine, even though my stove has gone cold. Other nights, I hear knocking on the walls 3 times, always 3. I've stopped checking the door. Whatever waits outside, it isn't looking for entry. It's reminding me. I've filled notebook after notebook since my last day in the cabin, drawing the symbols over and over, writing the fragments of words I thought I heard in the fire. I don't know why I keep at it. Maybe I believe if I map them fully, if I recreate the pattern, I'll unlock what the trappers in 1893 already knew, that the cabin is no accident, no shelter, but a seal. And maybe if I understand the seal, I'll understand the hunger behind it. But another part of me fears the opposite, that every mark I sketch, every word I repeat, is just another thread binding me closer to it. Maybe the act of remembering is itself a form of summoning. Sometimes I drive out to the lake where her camp was found. I park by the old trailhead, sit on the hood of my truck, and watch the water shift under the wind. I talk to her then, though I don't know if she hears. I tell her she deserved better, that whatever pulled her into those stones should never have touched her life. And I tell her that I'm trying, not just to carry her story, but to resist becoming another part of the cabin's hunger. I don't know if she finds comfort in my words, but I speak them anyway, because silence feels like surrender. The strangest part is how ordinary the mountains look to everyone else. People still hike those trails, still fish the streams, still camp beneath the same stars that now feel poison to me. They laugh around fires, not knowing that fire can carry whispers if you listen long enough. They drink from creeks that run down the same ridges that cradle the cabin's rotting timbers. They treat it all like wilderness, beautiful and harmless, while I carry the knowledge that the land itself has teeth. It makes me feel like I'm split in two, one half still a neighbor, a worker, a man who nods politely in town, the other half already half swallowed by the chimney's shadow. I've asked myself why I don't just burn it down. The cabin, the stones, the chimney, reduce it all to rubble and scatter it with dynamite if I must.
God knows I've thought about it.
But each time I let the idea take shape, I feel the weight press in, as if the land itself is warning me. Don't. That cabin has stood through fire, flood, rot, and storm. It has stood through decades of winters that bury peaks in ice. If men before me couldn't bring it down, why would I succeed? And worse, what if it isn't the cabin keeping the hunger trapped, but the chimney itself? What if destroying it doesn't free me, but frees what lives inside? That thought chills me deeper than any Montana winter ever could. So I live with it. I wake, I work, I pretend. And at night, when the wind claws at the eaves, I hear the chimney call. Sometimes it's her voice, soft, broken, pleading for release. Other times it's the deeper one, grinding like stone, promising that my time will come. I don't answer, not aloud, but my silence is an answer all the same. Because in my gut, I know the truth. One way or another, the mountains collect their due. Some vanish on trails. Some drown in creeks. And some of us are chosen for the stones, marked to become mortar in a chimney that should never have been built. If you're hearing this now, if somehow my notebooks survive me, if these words reach your eyes, then take it as a warning. Stay away from the drainage. Stay away from the clearing where the roof sags and the stones whisper. If you find the cabin, turn back before the shadows stretch long. Don't enter.
Don't touch the chimney.
Don't listen to the fire. Because once it knows your name, there's no leaving clean. I'm living proof of that, though I suspect not for much longer. One day soon, when the knocking comes again, I won't resist. I'll open the door, or the chimney will open for me. And when they find me, if they find me, it won't be in my bed or on a trail. It'll be in the soot and stone, another voice woven into the hunger that the mountains keep.